Every preacher faces a dilemma. The sermons he preaches, he wants to apply to the lives of people. But there are some people who need the sermon more than others, but they don't see themselves in that. For instance, you walk out into the foyer after a sermon and you're met by a fellow, and he says to you something like this: "Boy, I wish so and so would have been there this morning. He really needed to hear that." And inside, you just melt because he is so and so who needed to hear it. He just wouldn't see it. Because people have an image of themselves, and then they have a blind spot. They see themselves as they like to be, but not as they are. When things get too close to them, they throw up their shields to prevent any assault on who they believe they are. Jesus knew that. Seldom he would tell a person who they really were. Instead, he'd reveal it to them in a story. They would listen innocently, and then suddenly they would get this funny, uncomfortable feeling. And then there's the gotcha. And his stories are very portable. They applied to robe-wearing rabbis or a Brooks Brothers suited executive. The pauper and the proud can both hear and glean from the stories, because he evaluates and judges with a few simple words of, "Let me tell you a story." Among those stories is one we call the tax collector and the Pharisee. It is a story of comparison and contrast. But when you listen to it, what does Jesus want from us? Why does he tell us the story? In this passage we're going to look at tonight, there are really two storytellers. One is Jesus himself, and the other is the man who writes it down, Luke. First, Jesus, the storyteller, drove points to the heart of man. The outward part of his life was important only because it reflected the inside. Luke chapter 6 and verse 45, he said, "The good person comes out of the good treasure of his heart that produces good. And the evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, his mouth speaks." When you examine the life, he simply reveals the heart behind it. He spoke about hypocrisy, the play actor in all of us, who wants to put the prettiest mask on ourselves to hide the most tarnished of hearts. And he kind of speaks through smoked glass, enough for us to see, but not enough to make it clear. You have to look real close. Emily Dickinson said, "We want the truth, but we want it on a slant." Clement of Alexandria said it this way: "It is the nature of Scripture that it is written in brilliant obscurity, so that it is not available to every casual passerby. It is concealed." So Jesus puts a slant on it, where he can slide the truth to us. But the second storyteller in this is Luke. Luke writes it down. Luke takes this story that is told orally and puts it into Holy Writ. It's the only place we find it. He has captured something that would have been lost had he not said, "I think this is important." Because Luke writes a gospel like none other. Luke is the gospel of the underdog. He sprinkles his account with women who were considered property of Jewish husbands, prostitutes, Samaritans, and sinners. He loves prodigals and problem children. He elevates the sinner and smacks the nose lifters. And so Jesus says, "Let me tell you a story." Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: "God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get." But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went home to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Both men come to the temple to pray, but that's where the comparison ends, and the contrast is drawn in a very sharp pencil line. Think about these two men, how different they are. First, let's look at the Pharisee. What do you think of him? Would you like for him to be a church member? Would you like to make him an elder? Because if you listen to his life, it is absolutely sterling. You can't argue with what he is and what he's done. He says, I fast twice a week, but the law only required one. He went beyond. He tithes of his possessions, even though the law only demanded his income. He goes beyond. He's moral. He avoids the sins of both swindle and sexual indiscretion. The Pharisee is the faithful, dependable tithing type who pays the salaries of ministers so they can preach on the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. How will you evaluate that man based upon his spiritual resume? And then we turn to the corner in a shadow, hoping not to be seen, is the tax collector. What do you know about him? Well, we hear nothing of his spiritual life, his ability to keep the law, his faithfulness at synagogue, his Bible reading habits. We only know he prays because he comes here to pray. Jesus provides us a single piece of information that tells us all about him. He is a tax collector. And for Jews, it was enough to know that's who he was. He's working for a foreign government, collecting taxes from his own people, a participant in a cruel and corrupt system, politically a traitor, religiously unclean. If you met someone at church who was selling state secrets to China, would you pray beside them? So what's the problem in this parable? Let's break that down for a moment. Let's start with Pharisee. With all of what he does that is good, he has one simple flaw. He has his nose in the air. He compares himself to everybody and anyone beneath him. Listen to what he says. God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. That little word, this tax collector. It accompanies an outstretched finger of judgment and a tone of disdain. Renee Brown, who teaches psychology of leadership at the University of Houston, has done a lot of work in the concept of empathy, the ability to step in someone else's shoes. There is something, she says, that stops empathy dead in its tracks. There are only two words that can stop all people from being empathetic. At least. I had a miscarriage. Well, at least you know you can get pregnant. My marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. The attitude of at least separates us from other people. It puts a hand out that says, I don't want to deal with you. I'd rather just smooth it all over. The same is true about this tax collector. It tells you everything about what the Pharisee thinks about him. And we see it in the way the Pharisee stands, how he separates himself, the way he prays. In essence, at least I'm not like one of those sinners. Thank God for that. Then there's the tax collector. All we hear is a whispered, tear-filled sigh, hoisted in God's direction. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Now, that's not much of a prayer. Just a single line is hardly worth mentioning. It's hardly worth bothering the Almighty with something like that. He offers no repentance. He's not there with a box of silver taken from the people he's stolen from. It's just him beating his chest in obvious pain. And unlike the Pharisee who tells God how much he has, the tax collector can only petition for what he does not have. He asks for one thing: mercy. Usually that word is in heady theological prose, the word propitiate. He's asking, is there someone that can pay for my life and get me out of this prison? For I have nothing to bring but a plea. Nothing. I'm penniless spiritually. Nothing. Please, anything. A little mercy will help. And head bowed, the tears rolled down his cheeks. And as they say, that's all, folks. That's the end of the story. But it's hardly the end of the issue. There are three questions I'd like to ask you tonight as you read this story. Who's good in this story? Who is the sinner in this story? What does God care about in this story? On the surface, it's easy to judge. The Pharisee is moral and ethical. He'd make a great church member. The tax collector is someone that we might see him come in the church building and we call our policeman Chris over to us and say, can you keep an eye on that guy? He looks kind of suspicious. Beneath the surface, the Pharisee has a serious problem. He believes he's better. He's on top. He's better than everybody else, especially these people. I'm better than this other guy in the shadows beating his chest, so why does he even bother? God doesn't listen to the prayers of the wicked. You can hear him say it. Have you ever been tempted to think that way? Years ago, in one of my churches, I got a call from a church member who said, I have a neighbor that you probably need to go see. Now, the neighbor could have gone and seen him, but they left the dirty work to me, and so they called and I went. I knocked on a trailer door, and the trailer was hiked up on blocks and easily moved if needed to be. As I knocked on the door cracked open and the man came in. And he stood in front in the sunshine. He had a scraggly beard, a face that looks like he hadn't slept in years, and eyes that looked like he had drunk forever. As we talked, he didn't really want to talk. I kept asking, well, tell me a little bit about you. Is there anything I can help you with? Suddenly, a look crossed his face, and he became angry and saddened all at once. And he said, I know what you guys think of me. And I said, what do you think I think of you? He said, you know. I said, I'm sorry, I don't. And then he had a story that tumbled out of his mouth. He said, I've done something terrible and you'll never forgive me. Years ago, I had a girlfriend and I got her pregnant. And I forced her to get an abortion. What would you think? At least I'm better than him. Would those words at least come to your mind? But then there's the tax collector. All he comes is with a broken heart. He has no box full of good deeds and righteous pieties. He does come with a sacrifice. Oh, there's not a lamb. There's not the gold and silver demanded of the temple. His sacrifice is this. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. He brings the words of Psalm 51, verse 17. How do we resolve this? You have this really good Pharisee who's got this really bad attitude. You've got this This tax collector who seems to be the one who appeals to God better. How do you resolve that? Well, there's a human way. The human way is to condemn the Pharisee but praise the tax collector. But should you ignore the good the Pharisee did? And besides that, that's too easy a solution. I think the answer to the lesson is found in the before and after pictures. There's a before picture. It comes from Luke himself. He opens this parable by trying to explain why it's there. In verse 9, he says, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. This is Luke setting up the story, but he uses a word that comes out of the rhetoric, the word persuade. Christian people have a bad habit of persuading themselves of their own goodness. We persuade ourselves that our church attendance, our checked off daily Bible reading charts, and our year-end giving statements from the church office puts us on a pedestal, and we easily take our stand just a little higher than other people. And as long as we're on that pedestal, we're above other people. We're above the unsavory characters of life, whose speech is sprinkled with profanity or whose breath smells of Jack Daniels. Despises the guy who on Sunday morning is at home in his bathrobe when I got up and dragged myself to church. And we ask ourselves, doesn't this count for anything? It does for us personally. But then there's the after. The part that Jesus ties up in a nice little package. He says in verse 14, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humble, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus offers a commentary on his own story. If you want to be right with God, and one man is, the one begging for mercy, even though his life is lined with the spoils of filthy tax money that he collected. If you want to be right with God, there needs to be something in your heart that's begging for mercy. Because God sees something besides attendance cards at church. He sees a broken heart, a spirit pleading, and wounds of sin needing to be healed. And Jesus says, and we can remake our attitude. We can exalt ourselves like the Pharisee and watch God invite us to step off of our self-made pedestal in shame. And then he invites us to the back of the line and not to the front. Or we can approach our lives with the sense of the tax collector, a sinner begging for mercy, and not just for us, but for all of us in that same place, black or white, rich or poor, righteous or fallen. But it would be a mistake to tie a nice bow around a statement like, be like the tax collector rather than the Pharisee. Because the answer to the story is found in something much more profound. The trap of this parable is to think I am fortunate that I'm not like the Pharisee. In doing that, I'm exactly the same as the Pharisee. But is that not precisely Jesus' point, that we should realize we all need his undeserved mercy? We all come to a moment where we know that. Several years ago, I made a terrible mistake. One Wednesday night at church, I confronted a man out in the foyer that I had understood had done something, but I didn't understand. I had misunderstood. But I accused him of something terrible. He got heated and I got heated. I said things, he said things. It was private enough not to be seen, but public enough to be known. And the rest of that week I struggled with myself. What do you do? What do you do when you're the preacher who stands in front of the church who has the problem? Now, usually preachers don't respond to their own invitations. But that next Sunday I did. And I apologized to that man. I apologized to that church. I asked both to forgive me. I pleaded for mercy from God. And don't we all? The preacher in the pulpit, the person in the pew, the problem person in the aisles, the profligate in the streets. Don't we all need God's mercy?